Imagine visiting a national park and getting a standard Unigrid Park Service brochure full of charts, images, and maps that describe park attractions and resources. Now imagine getting that information in a way that is just as clear and informative for the visually impaired. The UniD project is actively closing this gap in accessibility, as well as developing protocols for describing visual information and interpretation in any context.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. Our guests are modern explorers working at the intersection of technology and the humanities. They help us to understand ourselves and the worlds we create in this digital age. They are thinkers, creators, makers, and academics, working in diverse fields like linguistics, technology, game and object design, and ethics. I'm your host, Craig Goldsmith.
I'm your host, Ellen Dornan.
On this program, we're joined by Dr. Brett Oppegaard, an associate professor in the School of Communications at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and the lead investigator of the UniD project. Brett, thanks so much for being with us on this program. Before we dive into some of the details about what you're doing, could you give us sort of just a big picture overview of what the UniD project actually is and what it's seeking to do?
Sure. Thank you for talking with me. The UniD project is basically set up to provide the infrastructure and training to have people create accessible media, particularly oriented toward people who are blind or visually impaired, but also people who are print dyslexic or just enjoy learning through their ears instead of their eyes.
What does that mean exactly then? Does that mean that it's the audiobook version of materials you would get at a museum or at a national park? What would that actually sound like?
Well, you think of an audio book or an audio tour, those are usually designed for people who have a level of normal vision. They often say things like, look to your right or look in the upper corner or things like that. Audio description is set up where there's no visual reference point to it. It's all information given through audible cues and text. I guess the key difference there is, yes, it practically is the same. You put on headphones and you listen to a voice or somebody talking or some performance in your ear, but there's not a reference to the visual part of it other than to create an equivalent experience.
What made you all decide to start this work with National Park Service brochures?
I worked with the Park Service for many years on other mobile media projects, and primarily my research is related to locative media, which means media that is connected to location. And with mobile devices, that has involved GPS and beacons and things like that. And one day, the people at the Park Service came to me and said, we're wondering what you can do about our brochures. Can you help us with this problem we have and making them accessible to people who can't see them? So that was really the start of the project. The Park Service came to me based on earlier research and asked if I could solve this problem.
Well, it seems like an especially challenging kind of publication to interpret for the visually impaired, because my experience of National Park Service brochures is that they are very heavy on art and maps and just conveying a tremendously rich amount of information through visual formats.
Right. The original experience I had with the park brochures involved me getting a box about the size of a suitcase mailed to me, and I open it up, and there's, about 350 brochures in there. I open up a brochure, and it's filled with maps and collages and photographs and tables and charts and timelines, and obviously it's silent, completely silent. And the charge was, how do you make this work for somebody who can't see it?
When I think of some of the national parks brochures where they have, say, a timeline of geology or a timeline of archaeology, do you describe those aspects of what is in the brochure?
Everything on the brochure is transferred into the audio format. Half of that work, or part of that work, is transcription, because there's text on there and we can just copy and paste that into our web tool and it'll create a machine voice version of that. But then the other big part of it, and it's actually actually probably more than half, is the translation of an image into a text. And doing that work takes a lot of thoughtful consideration about what the purpose of the original artifact is and then what the experience is intended to be. So when you say a timeline, it depends on what the timeline is. If the timeline is just a straight line with a hash marks that come out at different years and it's mostly text, then we primarily just transcribe that and then describe the line that connects them. But if the timeline has photographs integrated into them or illustrations or visual data of all types, then we describe each part of the timeline as a separate aspect of it.
So you said it's a machine voice. Is this mostly machine voices then? Because at first I was imagining it was, more like an audiobook where you had a professional voiceover person.
You have Morgan Freeman reading your Park Service brochures for you.
Right.
James Earl Jones, yeah.
Well, right. They're always not available to, when you have to change a word or something. And so a really important discussion we had at the start of the project was how would you have those voices perform the text? Would you hire people to do it or would you have a machine do it? For many practical reasons, the original format for the audio description is a machine voice. And it's practical not only in not being able to get Robert Redford available every time you want to change a word, but also the audience typically listens to audio description at several times the normal speed, like 4 to 6 times, sometimes 10 times normal speed. It's a very commonplace listening experience to hear a machine voice. It's also very quick to produce. And basically our tool allows people to type in the text or script. The program creates a machine voice. And then if you want to change it, you can do that very easily and flow that data into all the different parts, like the website, the mobile app, wherever you put it, without, again, having to call up the performer every time you want to change it. It's a good practical solution to it.
So something I hadn't considered because I'm not visually impaired, the target user here is already used to listening to a machine voice speaking at a fairly rapid pace. I would almost call it an audio literacy. They're more practiced than I would be at listening to that information in that way.
Absolutely, and it's also almost like a superpower. One consultant I work with can listen at 20 times normal speed. I literally can't even tell one word what it is, and he just knows every part of it. It's just amazing.
And with that in mind, I think we have a little snippet that we can play of what one of these audio descriptions sounds like. This is from the brochure for Golden Gate National Park. So let's take a quick little listen to what this actually sounds like.
Site highlights. Visit the Golden Gate Bridge Plaza, hike in the Marin Headlands, explore the Redwood Forest at Muir Woods, tour the Presidio in San Francisco, walk along the ocean cliffs at Land's End, hike the newest GGNR trails in San Mateo County.
Okay, that was pretty interesting. Some of this you obviously can just cut and paste the text and generate this machine voice, but on some of it, it requires a lot more writing, I would think, to sort of describe something. So if you have a photograph or a piece of art in one of these pieces of material, who is it that goes about deciding how to describe that in a way that the visually impaired person is sort of used to getting that information, or in a way that's really going to work in an audio format? I mean, are there people that this is their job to describe things in this way? Is that a career?
Yeah, there are people who do it professionally. There's not a national certification program, so those are all kind of ad hoc consultant type work as professionals. There are some people who are trying to create a certification, including our research team has been working with a group that's founded at the American Council of the Blind, who's our primary collaborator, and we're working on a national certification to get some standards that transfer across basically organizations and personalities. But the main question, again, when we got back to the start of the project was, how are we going to do this? You get a box in the mail with some brochures. How are you going to make this happen? And we had the option of hiring professional describers to do it, or we had the option of creating an infrastructure to let everybody take a shot at it. And that's where we decided to head and create an open source, open access platform for people to work on it. And we provide a training for people that basically gives overviews and tips on different genres of description. And then our thinking has been to allow the content matter experts or the subject matter experts at each place do the description because they know the most about the place. It's much easier for us to train somebody how to write audio description than it is for us to train somebody about all the intricacies of Yellowstone National Park.
So you're actually doing collaborations with the park interpreters and the American Council of the Blind.
That's right. So we bring together American Council of the Blind, staff and volunteers. They're with us side by side on everything we make and every description we write, and they give feedback directly to the interpreters. Sometimes it's different, not just interpreters at the parks, but other staff members, like historians would be a good example. We bring together these collaborators and have them work on the descriptions together with a constant feedback loop that allows people who aren't blind to get the sense of, is this working or not? And people who are blind to get the sense of what I want. And I'm trying to communicate that to the person writing the description.
And then on the UniD side, once you have this text that's going to be turned into the machine voice, then that can be deployed across people's phones, in a website. Is that sort of, in a way, the end product as far as how the visually impaired person is actually going to get to listen to this material?
We have a variety of ways they can listen to it. Like you said, there's a website version, there's mobile app versions, there's MP3 versions, so people can just get audio files. And the website HTML is marked up specifically for screen readers. And when you talked earlier about the superpower of listening to machine voice, in ACP or people who are low vision or blind, they're very used to going to a website and using a screen reader to listen to a whole page. So that's basically the browsing experience that they have. And we've worked with that group to create mobile apps and website content that works really well with screen readers.
So in a way, you're extending work that's been done in other contexts already, but to these places where previously there was no avenue for the visually impaired person to get that information.
It sounds like the platforms were there and the technology was there. It was a matter of pulling together a methodology for describing this really rich visual information. Is that sort of how you pulled all the pieces together?
Well, and there was no production tool that we could find. So we created the production tool, which is the UniD website. What that allows people to do is to organize and write the description and then share it with people. There were screen readers and there were mobile apps. There's a mobile web and there's all that existed. But if you wanted to describe your national park, there was no way to produce that and then get those into those systems. Everybody who enjoys radio, everybody who's listening to this program, they already do this type of thing, learning through their ears, but they don't think about where they're not allowed to do it.
We've talked about the brochures because I guess that was one of the first pushes, but does this also include descriptive audio for things like the wayside signs?
Well, yeah, it's interesting to think about audio description as basically having two areas in which it works. Number one, in dynamic media like theater, television, movies. That was where this research really started in the early 1970s. One guy, Greg Fraser, sitting on a couch with his blind friend watching the movie High Noon, and he was describing it to his blind friend as the movie played, and he thought, wow, this is really interesting. This should be studied, and he started to do scholarly research on it, and that's led to quite a bit of development. That was on the West Coast, and in parallel on the East Coast, there was a group a few years later that started to describe opera and theater and live events, and that group, based in Washington, D.C., developed its own style of doing this. So we had a West Coast version and an East Coast version, but all of it was kind of related to things that were happening live. The other arm is static media, so media that doesn't move, like photographs and maps and illustrations, whatever. And those transfer pretty well across formats. If you're describing a photograph in a brochure or a wayside sign or an exhibit, they still need to be described. It's just in those other settings, like a wayside sign, you also want to describe what's the physical environment like around the sign.
What an amazing project and effort. You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
Brett, thanks so much for talking with us about the UniD project, your audio descriptions of national park brochures. You've been doing this for several years now, right? So you've been getting feedback from park visitors and from users. What are you hearing about the applications?
Well, thank you again for having me. This has been one of the most rewarding parts of the project, has been just the little comments you get, or even the big comments you get from groups. But little comments you get from people that say, this made a great difference in my life. For example, we had one American Council of the Blind member who had lived her entire life 6 miles away from Minuteman National Park. She'd never been there. We invited her over. We had her listen to our descriptions. And she just marveled at what an experience it was, that she had just never felt welcome there. She never felt like there was anything for her to do. There was never any kind of outreach to her, but this project made that kind of difference. And we get these sort of comments all the time, and it's not just national parks. There's a whole segment of society that is kind of cut off to people who are low vision or blind or just prefer to experience the world through other senses than their eyes. And we've just found that by imagining the world as a multisensory place and imagining the world as something that you can learn about in more ways than one, that I think people really respond well to that.
If we have these audio descriptions, so someone who either prefers or has to get their information through their ears, is there any sort of cross-platform or sensory work so that there's more, say, touch involved? I'm just thinking if I had to go, say, to a national park with a blindfold on, the audio descriptions are great, but does that come with more opportunity to touch rocks?
Yeah, this is a story I hear quite frequently from people who are blind, who've been to national parks before. And one story that comes up quite often is people say, well, yeah, I went on this drive to a national park and it was just like driving around a parking lot. Nobody described anything to me. There's no, it's just missing out on so many aspects of what the experience can be for people. And audio description combined with tactile exhibits is a very rich experience for everybody. And if you imagine your fingertips as sensors that can bring in information to you, and very rich information, and then you imagine you're listening to somebody describe what you're touching, you can learn a lot from that. You can kind of imagine being a mechanic underneath a car and you're feeling around for a part you need to remove or something. You don't need your eyes for that. You just need somebody to tell you, it feels like this and it's got a nut this size or whatever, and that people can experience the world in all sorts of rich ways.
You've done audio descriptions for over 100 parks. Do you know in any of those parks whether they've followed up to make their interpretive programs or their visitor centers or whatever more robustly multisensory to accommodate a wider range of visitors?
Well, I think that's the direction everybody's headed. Like you said earlier, that all the designers of museum exhibits are imagining the world in multisensory ways now, because they've come to realize, and you probably had this experience where you go into a museum and there's an exhibit with hundreds of objects and dozens of texts and dozens of photographs, and it just hits you like a fire hose. And after about 15 seconds, you're ready to move on to the next thing. And what we found in research in museums is that people spend a lot less time on these exhibits than the designers imagine. The designers might imagine you're going to spend 5 minutes there, and people spend 5 seconds. And I think part of that's because the exhibit's only speaking to them through one sense, and that's through the eyes, and it's just kind of overwhelming them with the visual elements. And people crave more than that. And also your brain kind of gets full of all that information coming through one sense. So when you combine these other options, people can go to what they want and try what they want, but also, I think, learn more dynamically.
To me, thinking about it and thinking what I know about park visitor studies and meaningful experiences, I can see now why it would behoove someone like me to bring my little UniD app to my park visits so that I can sort of take things in with my eyes and listen to the descriptions to sort of pull information in on another channel, because it can be overwhelming.
Well, you can also use the UniD app before you go, and this is typical use of our audio descriptions. As people listen to it before they go, they think about, okay, what would be most interesting to me as a person who's blind or visually impaired? Where are the tactile exhibits? Where are the rocks we can climb on or touch or or whatever it is. And then that also helps to plan the experience. And then when you get there, you can use the descriptions to remember what you learned before, when you're planning your trip. And then another use we found for it is people like to listen to it afterward. And, remember that inkstand I was able to touch and feel? I want to listen to that description again.
It acts as a planning tool and not just as a description tool.
It's like what I said earlier about driving on the park or something. You don't know what's around you or what's happening. If you don't have access to the information and you can't take part in the planning, then where do you think people are going to take you? They're not going to take you to the things you want to do. This even goes down to the gift shop experience. You go into a Park Service gift shop and the person will say to you, yeah, there's some keychains, there's some t-shirts, there's some picture frames, whatever. And what do you want to buy? And it's like, well, can you be more specific? It's like, what kind of t-shirt? There's a t-shirt with a polar bear on it. Okay, so what kind of polar bear? Does a polar bear have a Santa hat on? Is a polar bear eating a fish? I want to have my own style, and I want to have a t-shirt that I want, not just what somebody picks for me. That's how deep I think it goes in terms of realizing the separation and how ostracized people are without vision. They really don't have a lot of agency in a lot of these experiences, and so we're trying to give that back to them.
I'm feeling actually kind of almost stupid and naive. It hadn't even occurred to me how difficult it could be to just go buy a t-shirt at a gift store if you wanted to be able to pick out the appropriate thing without having someone describe it to you in detail. Because UniD is providing infrastructure as an open source project for creating these kinds of audio descriptions, I was thinking, is there a way that you could leverage a platform like this to go into a gift store, and if I move my phone around or if I have someone do it for me, then I get sort of detailed descriptions of each item?
You're exactly right. That's the potential there in technology, is to change these systems to allow everybody access to them. I do have a colleague, and I've been working with him on some ideas about doing some RFID research, in particular with tactile objects, because oftentimes at a visitor center, the tactile objects are there, but there's not someone there to tell you what they are. And so if you're imagining complete independence and full agency at a site, you want to be able to walk up like anybody else and touch the tactile exhibit and know what it is. And we think RFIDs offer some potential for that.
With these audio descriptions, you said that some people started doing these descriptions for live events first, what you call dynamic experiences, I guess is what you called it. And then there's static material like photographs, maps, a Mars rock, or whatever. I'm still wondering, how do you go about describing some of these things like a map for someone? I know you said one of your goals is training people to be able to do this. If they're the expert in the material, then they can learn how to do this. But how do you even approach something so abstract like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that was one of the biggest challenges we found. When we received the box of brochures, a colleague and I spent about a year just kind of deconstructing the brochure, like what is it, what does it include, what are all the different parts. And then one of the things, of course, was a map. Almost every brochure has a map, not every brochure, but almost every brochure. And then what we came to understand about the map was that there are different types of maps. Some are for navigation, some are for cultural awareness, some are for natural awareness. There's all these different purposes for them. What we then decided to do is try to figure out what are the different purposes of a map. And once you can determine the purpose of the map, so for example, some maps are set up to show you what it used to look like 100 years ago. Now it's just a field like at Gettysburg or something. Those maps are different than ones that try to tell you how to get around town and get to the different points of interest. And then those maps are also different than the ones that tell you the elevation of the mountain and where the streams are. And so we first recommend that people determine what was the purpose of this map being included and what was it trying to communicate. And once you determine that, then you can start to break apart the purpose into a description.
You said earlier that, say, if you're describing a piece of art that appears in a brochure, you want to have the context and that you turn to your subject matter experts for help with all of that. Did they help with the maps as well, or is this structure that you came up with?
Yeah, we interviewed stakeholders across the spectrum. So we interviewed cartographers, we interviewed interpreters, we interviewed historians, we interviewed people who came to parks wanting to use maps. We started just asking them, what do you want to know from a map and what do you think a map is? And one of the curious comments we got from quite a few people who are blind is, why would a blind person need a map? And it sort of floored us at first. We thought, if a blind person doesn't think they need a map, why would they need a map? This disenfranchisement is so deeply ingrained that people who are blind don't even think they need that. So we, in some respects, had to figure out how to do it, and in other respects, had to communicate why it's important.
I grew up being dragged around to every Civil War national park, battlefield, monument, and I was thinking about maps of battles, which is actually important. This is where a given division was, and they moved down this hill, and then the other division came up from the river. And on a battle map, you can see that very clearly and sort of take it in quickly, but to have it described could actually be extraordinarily useful.
Yeah, the map's not communicating this is how you go around the riverbed and up the hill. It's just communicating that that's what other people did, and that's why it's important to know the terrain.
It's telling a story, actually, in a
Yeah.
certain sense, over time.
A temporal story.
So you spent a few years now coming up with some sort of nascent standards for doing this kind of work and a platform for actually helping to generate these descriptors in a way that is technologically available to a broad chunk of the population. Has it been successful with the end users? How useful is this to the target audience?
Well, we keep data on it, and it's exceptionally popular. I'm a little bit skeptical of our own data because it's one of those things where if you've never been given any access and then you're given some access, of course you'll love it. What I'm trying to push us past is the kind of original response of from zero to something, and now I want to make it from something to great. I think sometimes we do great work and it has set standards, and then other times I think it's very functional, and that's fine too. But I'm trying to push the whole idea beyond functional. And that relates to, we recently received a National Endowment for the Arts grant for a project in San Francisco to work on collaborating with some sound artists to do audio description around the Goldsworthy Walk in the Presidio area. That's basically an area where a prominent international artist has created sculptural type elements, and we would describe that in a certain way, in a functional way, a utilitarian way, but we also want to see what would happen if you bring sound artists into this and have them do their magic. Can we push audio description beyond just utilitarian discourse and put it into an artistic aesthetic?
It sounds like a great multi-channel thing that anybody could enjoy, whether they were visually impaired or not.
Yeah, and one of the sculptures is really interesting. It's on the ground and it's tactile. It's like a line on the ground that you can feel with your feet, but that's the sculpture. And so there'll be the descriptive part of that in a utilitarian way, like what is this trail? Why are you on it? What did the artist want to communicate? Then there'll be the tactile part, and then there'll be the sound art part of whatever our artists come up with. And we're going to be working on that in the fall and see where it takes us. So I'm very excited about just seeing, can we push this beyond everyday useful information into something that has the kind of inspiration that art can provide.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
Brett, I'm a little curious because it started out as a project just simply describing park brochures, and it's expanded to this whole open source web tool and a learning support system so that people across the world can learn how to do audio descriptions and contribute them. Can you talk a little bit about that evolution?
Good question. It kind of grows different arms every day. I think it started with the idea that we had a fresh slate when we were sent the box of brochures, and I think we took a perspective on it that was maybe not shaped by history or who had done it before or what they thought people should do, and that allowed us to kind of imagine what it could be. We also didn't have any kind of commercial profit motivations or anything like that. We were just truly investigating it as an intellectual exercise. And then once we got into this, we realized there's a major social justice issue at play here in which people are not being treated fairly. They're being left out. I mean, a large number of people, millions of Americans, are being kept from public resources just because the media isn't accessible. And that motivated a lot of our decisions to try to open this up and make it as accessible as possible and try to really build a systematic way to solve this problem as opposed to just, say, describing 40 or 50 brochures and calling it good.
We've done a bunch of programs now where a theme is emerging of access, the democratization of information and techniques, and this just sort of seems to fit right along with that. With UniD, can anyone go and use this tool to create audio descriptions for which there is not an audio description, or is this just limited to sort of your official crew?
Anybody with an internet connection and a computer can log on, make a free account, go into our Academy part of the website, learn a little bit about audio description, and start creating it. And we've had people from all over the world doing descriptions, just in some of the most surprising places. I had a person write me an email up from Manoa, North Dakota, a snow park there, and he had decided to describe his snow park. And I had a graduate student in Milan, Italy, who wanted to do his graduate studies on descriptions in El Duomo in Milan, the largest Catholic church in Italy, I believe. The tool is powerful enough and flexible enough to meet most of their needs.
What's the most unusual place or object or whatever that someone's done an audio description of?
The snow park was funny because we don't ever see snow in Hawaii, and it's kind of like the opposite environment. From a place that's never had snow to a place that all there is snow. I enjoyed that one.
Well, I just wonder what it would be like to describe the church in Milan, because it seems like everywhere you look, there's something architectural, there's something artistic, it's all very meaningful, it's all filled with import and context. With your academy, do you teach people to approach the context of the visual information as well?
Yeah, one of the hardest parts of this type of description is it's nonlinear and non-narrative. It's basically stimulating your visual sense all at once with information, and then your mind decides what to focus on. And so when someone's describing it, they have to do that work in a way that allows their interpretation to lead it, but also to keep it open for other people and different interpretations. One of the more novel parts of our project is the creation of a table of contents. So each description you make creates an automatic table of contents, which allows the screen reader to navigate through the table, and you can decide what you want to listen to and in what order. Screen reader is linear, so it starts at the top of the app page, and when you swipe right, it'll go down the table of contents until you find that topic that interests you, and then you select it, and it'll jump to that description. And then once you're done with that description, you can jump back to the table of contents. That's been one of the most popular innovations of our project. The second most popular thing has been sort of an accidental innovation. When we were creating the descriptions, we needed to say what it was, that we were setting up for the person to describe. So I would put in all caps like photo or map or something like that. And when we were testing it, sometimes we'd leave that in there just to see what people thought. And it's amazing how powerful that orientation can be if you just know that you're getting the description of a photo at the start of the description, as opposed to you're getting something described to you and you don't even know what it is. And that was a big revelation to us.
Almost like an audio icon.
Yeah, almost like an audio icon. It gives you a little trigger to help you contextualize what comes after it.
Right, or an audio legend. That's really interesting.
It has been a full 30 years since the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And so I'm a little bit flabbergasted that it's taken 30 years to really start fleshing out these protocols and working toward a standardization of providing this kind of access for all visitors.
Well, it is flabbergasting, and there are different regulations for different groups. Like private organizations have different regulations than the federal government. The federal government doesn't conform to ADA, it has a separate set of guidelines. And I think part of it is the challenge of audio description is so much greater than, say, the challenge of captioning, where you have a transcription created by whatever the people are saying on the screen, and then you add a few orientation markers to that. But in a description, as we talked about, it's an incredibly complex translation process at times, and that can't be automated very easily. So I think that part of the reason why audio description is so far behind captioning in terms of development. And then you think of other things like curb cuts. Curb cut was originally created for wheelchair access, but it became something that every person uses. People with a baby in a stroller, or people carrying a heavy object, or whatever. Curb cuts have been completely destigmatized, and nobody thinks about them as an accessibility feature of their city. Captioning is moving along that way, and I think that's part of the challenge. Is audio description's been stigmatized and kept in a kind of an accommodation sort of box, and that prevents it from being developed.
Was there any sort of research in this area before you all started looking at how to approach doing the Park Service brochures?
Well, there was research in the 70s. It was started on the dynamic media by Greg Fraser with his friend watching the television, and that was his thesis. But most of it has been ad hoc best practices, kind of accommodation type work. There's very little empirical research that's been done. And there has been a group that's emerged in Europe. They've been working on empirical studies for about 10 years in this field, and they've done some great work. But in the United States, it's pretty much stagnated around the best practices, not a lot of empirical research at all.
Brett, what do you mean by accommodation work? I don't understand that terminology.
Accommodation can be as simple as, okay, we're not going to audio describe our whole brochure and exhibit center. If somebody blind comes to our site, we'll have a park ranger walk around with them and accommodate them. Even if this person has no training in audio description, even if this person's never worked with a blind visitor before, it's a way to basically satisfy the lowest standard of the law, but not really provide a great inclusive experience.
As opposed to what it sounds like you're trying to do with UniD, which is really get this sort of descriptive work encoded in the very DNA of projects going forward, whether it's an art installation or a national park site. Is that accurate?
Our aim is equivalent experience. So no matter what your abilities, and that could be a hearing impairment, could be any number of things. Being colorblind, you should be able to come to a place and have an equivalent experience to everybody else. And that really gets back to kind of a workflow issue, and then privileging one sense over another. If you can eliminate it at the source, it's a lot better than trying to come back and fix everything afterward.
Say I was setting up my interpretive materials for a national park and it hadn't been done before. You would prefer to see all of this being done at the same time that I'm writing my brochure and doing my wayside interpretive material, because that's when I'm actually thinking about the concepts that I'm trying to express about why this particular site is important to begin with.
That's the best time to do it. It's the easiest time. It also affects all your other decisions. For example, if you're making a film and you have a voiceover in your film, you can just add the description right into the voiceover instead of doing it separately later. It's a way of thinking about including as many people as possible instead of maybe, say, pushing the visual aspect to its ultimate artistic extreme or something like that.
Including all the senses.
Yeah, including all the senses. There's a million ways you can learn something. If you're always forced down the same tube, people get tired of doing that, and even if the information's good, they don't want to do it anymore.
I've had fantasies for a long time about locative applications in national parks or in other cultural organizations, museums, destination places where you could get pushed interpretive information about a site when you get there. And I'm just sort of imagining a Park Service map that has all the accessible facilities marked out for, say, the mobility impaired. You can find your accessible campgrounds or the accessible visitor center or whatever. Does your UniD app have any push capability that's tied into location? I mean, is that something that you're sort of visualizing, that people could sort of, oh, here are all the points in Yellowstone National Park where I can get on-site information for the visually impaired?
Yeah, to me, there are two main arms of mobile technologies that are interesting as opposed to just having a small computer. One part is the locative aspect and the other part's the social aspect. So with the social aspect, you can share what you're doing with your friends at all times, and that's a whole other thing. But with the locative aspect, I find it very fascinating to imagine a place that talks to you as you go through it and responds to your movement, responds to your interests, and tailors information in that place to what you're selecting as most interesting to you. Our project has two areas of locative development at this point. Number one, we have geotagged all the different sites that we've worked with, and that's more than 100. And when you open the app, it'll sort to the one closest to you. And then within each project, there's the capability in our tool to geotag each description, which works well for outdoor things. For example, if you're going up and down the Blue Ridge Parkway and you're driving in your car and you have your app on, it'll vibrate your phone when you get to one of these places that has a description, and it'll pop to your screen and you can listen to it. And there's a lot more that can be done, but those are the first steps.
Aside from your own work doing the National Park Service brochures and some of the National Park interpretive information, has there been widespread adoption of this technique and these standards elsewhere?
Well, we've primarily been working in the Park Service because when I think about public resources, I think about what's the biggest investment we have in our places in our country and in our cultural development as Americans. And these are the places that, we need to definitely make sure those are accessible. And there are 419 of those, and we only have audio description in about 100. And like I said, there's other places that have done other things that provide accessibility at these parks. I'm not saying that's the only way you can have an accessible park is to use our project. But I'm saying there's still a lot of work to do in that. That said, I had a call recently with a person from the U.S. Forest Service, and we were talking about this. They want to work with us, and they're going to be working in our next training with us, and they have 500-something sites. So you can imagine there's almost 1,000 sites. I'm also working in our next Descriptathon with Parks Canada, and so they have their whole system of national parks throughout Canada. It's not something, again, that I want to go to each individual site and do this work. I want to create a system that allows people to do this work. What we want is to have everybody take this into consideration when they're doing design and to gradually make everything inclusive and accessible.
A Descriptathon? I heard you throw that out a minute ago. What's a Descriptathon?
So our trainings, we call Descriptathons, and they're like hackathons. We get people together. We've had as many as 28 national parks represented in them. We put them into a tournament-like bracket, and we give them challenges, and we have them describe things, and we have our American Council of the Blind volunteers judge them, and each round they pick the winners of each matchup. So it could be like Yellowstone versus Yosemite or, whatever, and those people move on and win prizes. And by the end of the training, we've had a lot of fun. We've taught people about audio description, and the world's a more accessible place because they've completed their brochure. So that's kind of the goal of the Descriptathon.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
I would like to start by talking a little bit about both the platform and the protocols that you've developed, because it sounds like all of it is sort of groundbreaking and filling in a hole for others. So you have this great open source platform, and you teach people the different protocols for creating audio descriptions of different kinds of information. I'm looking at the Chaco Culture brochure right here. It just has a huge image right at the top. So I'm curious about what the protocols would be for describing a picture like this.
Again, we get back to why did the person put it in the brochure in the first place? And it has some message that it's trying to communicate to the visitor. And typically, there are many kind of nested messages in there. There might be an architectural message, there might be an environmental message, there might be something based on how the people are living, like how the size of their homes, the material in their homes. And so our recommendation is to think about the big picture first and describe that in a kind of a general way, and then create smaller pictures around certain themes. For example, you could have an architecture theme or a what life was like theme or whatever you can pull from that image. One mantra in audio description is to just say what you see and to not go into the rabbit hole of what you know about it. And so that's a kind of a fine line there that's difficult to draw a lot of times. Like, okay, if you don't see any people, then you probably don't describe any people. And that's also part of giving someone agency over the interpretation of the image. And what I mean by that is if you tell people how to interpret an image, then you're taking away some of the fun of experiencing the image.
In lay terms, it's resisting the urge to kind of editorialize.
Exactly, editorialize and also telling people things that are beyond what the image is really trying to tell you. And I guess one example we had in one of our descriptathons that was kind of interesting was in the Everglades, and there was a bird that was swooping in toward the ground, and you could just see kind of the bird in the ground. You didn't really know what the bird was doing. And the describer, who was a park interpreter at the Everglades, said, well, he's swooping in to grab this type of ferret or whatever it was that he usually eats. And we said, well, how do you know that? And he said, well, because I've seen that bird do that 1,000 times, and that's what the bird's doing. And so we had this kind of boundary dispute over, well, do you say that he's doing that, or do you just say, oh, if you describe the talons in this way and the wings at this angle, then the person who knows that will know what the bird is doing.
If I had, say, a piece of material that I was creating an audio description for, and there was a caption that said all those things, then I would want to include the text of the caption in my audio description, I would think.
Right. So when we describe an image, we transcribe the caption. Then we also have related text. So we try to respect what the person creating the brochure wanted to do with that design.
Because if I'm putting in an image that's just meant to be evocative, then my audio description would just be evocative. But if I'm putting in an image and accompanying it with an entire paragraph of explanatory text, here's a bird, and this bird is about to capture its prey out of the water and so forth, then I would also want that to be in my audio description.
Right, and then also there are some things that the designer isn't intending to convey. For example, if you get an image of somebody kayaking on a beautiful lake and they're wearing an orange shirt, and you really don't care what kind of shirt they're wearing, but the shirt's orange, so you put that into the description and people say, well, why do we care if the shirt's orange? Something we're missing here?
I just get the feeling that you may be able to get a lot more information out of an audio description than you would if you were just glancing at a picture.
A lot of times, similes or metaphors can be very helpful in descriptions, and they rarely get used.
But it seems like that may end up just conveying a lot more information than somebody who's only getting the visual information would be able to have.
That's true, and that's why I think it has universal appeal. Because if somebody's interested in looking at the picture, they probably want to know more than what they already know. Otherwise, why would they look at it? And that's why I prefer the kind of storyteller or telling your friend type approach. What would you tell your friend who's never seen this kind of pottery before, and start with that? One thing I'm interested in studying is use of simile. In this case, could be it looks like a coffee cup or something like that. And then people think, oh, now I can picture that because I've seen a coffee cup. And that type of description, I think, helps everybody when they start to imagine, well, they were using coffee cups or things that look like coffee cups 2,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. Isn't that interesting? And it just gives them more connections between their own ideas and then what the resource is offering them.
So again, you're talking about equivalent experience. You're making it all real and meaningful.
Right. Equivalent is the goal. And then what does equivalent mean? That's somewhat of debate. But what I think of it as, if you were going to look at that photo and spend time with that photo and you're just an average everyday visitor, what would you want out of that experience? And try to give a person who can't see it that same feeling.
We've been talking about some of the tools and practices that you're trying to establish with UniD for doing these kind of audio descriptions. And I know we focused a lot on this program about your work with the national parks, but I was thinking a lot about how I would describe an art opening. I like to go to art openings. I like to support my local visual artists and sculptural artists. So you also have, I think, protocols and standards for how you would break down something like an artwork into little audio description chunks.
When we're dealing with an image of an artifact, we start with some of the basic attributes, like what's it made of, what color is it, what size is it, what shape is it, how old it is. And then we can also think about how is it made, because a lot of people are really interested in process. And then it will fork pretty dramatically into like what are the details and use, significance, context of this artwork. And those can all lead to what I think are the great discussions you have in an art gallery about the piece and what it means to humanity or what the artist intended. And we're not trying to finish those discussions, we're just trying to start them and give people that same opening that other people have.
In a technical and practical sense, if I were creating these descriptions, that would actually be broken down into separate little files that would be accessible via this table of contents that a screen reader can use. In my table of contents, I might have something like, what is the material of the piece? What is the color palette of the piece? What does it weigh? And then the actual description. Is that sort of what it ends up coming out as from the UniD platform?
Yeah, you definitely could do it that way. And I'd take one step backward. I'd say, what does the gallery space look like? What's it decorated like on the outside? When you walk through the door, how big is this space? What's the floor made out of? What color are the walls? There's all these parts of the setting that we kind of take for granted visually as well, that a person who's blind wouldn't have any access to that.
You have to set the stage, really.
You got to set the stage and then let people find what they want. I did an interesting experiment in one of my classes where I brought in one of my research assistants who's blind, and we had the students just describe the classroom to her. And we went around, each person did their best description, and at the end of it, we asked my research assistant, well, what does this room look like to you? And she explained, what she thought it was after hearing all the descriptions, and then we could all see that this was totally skewed, not anything like what the room really looked like. And I thought that was a really profound way to think about the limitation.
It sounds like at UniD there's a mix of professionals that are creating descriptions and people that have sort of been through your training process through UniD Academy. You also have members of the public who can go and submit audio descriptions of things that they might have of interest. So given what you just said about your research assistant, is there any kind of vetting of audio descriptions that's happening, or at this point, because it's so nascent, are you just taking what you can get? And how do you evaluate the quality of these descriptions?
Yeah, we have multi-levels of feedback for each description, and all the feedback comes from people in the American Council of the Blind, people that are either blind or low vision. It starts with our training where we do the different activities and get feedback on, say, how to describe an artifact, and people practice it and get feedback there. Then they describe their different parts of their brochures, like let's just say, for example, they had an artifact in their brochure that they described, and so they could reflect on the feedback they received in the training, then they get to do it on their own. And then after the brochure is complete, we give it back to the American Council of the Blind. They have a panel that listens to it to make sure it works for them. And then we put it into the public app for beta testing. As part of the beta testing, we bring a group of ACB volunteers who live near the park to the site and have them tested on site. And we have a couple focus groups that are a part of that process. And that creates a really interesting dynamic where the describer gets to hear what people think of it, but also it builds a relationship between the local park person and the local community of people in ACB. And oftentimes that's led to, kind of long-lasting and enduring friendships and partnerships.
ACB being the American Council for the Blind.
Right, ACB being the American Council of the Blind.
So for the brochures, you've got a really thorough and tight methodology for a kind of feedback loop for getting the quality. So say I was going to do a description of an art show that was up for a month or two, and I wanted to use the UniD platform. Is there also like a rating system? Because in the end, if the target audience is the visually impaired, can they rate an audio description? Is there any kind of social media feedback on the platform?
We have internal systems that we're considering opening up to the public pretty soon, maybe even as soon as by the end of this year. We have what are called Likert scale questions, which are basically you agree with a statement, you moderately agree, you're neutral, you disagree, etc. And we can ask people about different aspects of the description. For example, I've been working on the public health aspects of description and whether they make you feel socially included or excluded. And so some of the questions can be as simple as, do you feel like this description makes you feel like you were welcome here? And so those kinds of feedback loops allow us to go beyond just, say, qualitative, do you like it or not?
Or the question might be, did this description make you feel like you could discuss this artwork with other people that had experienced this artwork in a way that was meaningful?
I think your question's a really good one. Or you could even ask, did it provoke a conversation? And they can say yes or no.
And it's free, you said?
Yep, all free. All our trainings are funded by Google or National Park Service. So all the people that participate in our trainings, those are no cost either.
Anyone who's listening to this program, if they were interested in getting up to speed or enhancing their ability to do these kind of audio descriptions, can go to the UniD website and sign up for free and do some training exercises and try these techniques out.
Yep, absolutely. And if they want to be involved in our Descriptathons, let me know and we'll try to work something out on that too.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the idea of describing an art opening. One of my graduate students is a realtor, and she described an open house. Imagine, okay, if a person's blind or low vision and they want to buy a house, and this is the biggest purchase they'll make, and sort of like the T-shirt thing, they want to have agency and input on the choice, and they want to have all the details to make that as an informed choice as possible. And so this kind of description gives access to all that kind of information.
I can see why this all became an issue of social justice for you and not just a curiosity and a research question.
Yeah, even imagine something like going on to Amazon and trying to buy something on there. They have product descriptions that are based on technical things like how big it is or how much it weighs. But typically the descriptions don't say what it looks like or what the picture looks like. And that's just a major gap in a person's ability to participate in current society.
Brett, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been an ear-opening discussion.
Well, thank you for your interest and enthusiasm. I really enjoyed the conversation.
And if you would like more information about the UniD project or to take the UniD Academy training, you can visit their website at unidescription.org. That's UNIdescription.org. And you have been listening to Augmented Humanity, which is a program of the New Mexico Humanities Council produced in partnership with KUNM-FM. You can visit us online and find out more about our programs at nmhumanities.org. Our theme music comes courtesy James Whiten, and we've had production assistance from Tristan Klum.